Put a finger down if you have been called a racial slur. Put a finger down if you've been followed in a store unnecessarily. Put a finger down if someone has crossed the street to avoid passing you. Put a finger down if you've had someone clench their purse in an elevator with you. Put a finger down if you've had someone step off of an elevator to keep from riding with you.
I literally was in my car, as you can see from the video, and I grabbed a pen and a paper, and I said, well, I'm gonna just write a list of things that I have been through that have been completely related to me based on my race. And I'm like, well, I'll just post it online and encourage people to do it as well so that we can all compare our experiences.
Any fingers left? That's privilege.
I get this question all the time. Well, that's the way the elevators work. How would you know if somebody was stepping off the elevator because of you? And I say this all the time. If you have experienced it, you know. And so to see thousands of videos with other people saying, yep, I've had somebody step off an elevator to keep a ride with me. It's an avoidance factor. There's different levels of discrimination. And I wanted people that had not experienced it themselves to also consider had they done it. And if you had done it, look at how you're making somebody feel about it. Look at, how you are not being open to just relating to this other person as if they are human.
Put a finger down if you've been accused of not being able to afford something expensive. Put a finger down if you have had fear in your heart when being stopped by the police. Put a finger down if you have never been given a pass on a citation that you deserved. Put a finger down if you have been stopped or detained by police for no valid reason. Put a finger down if you have been denied service solely because of the color of your skin. Put a finger down if you have been bullied solely because of your race. Put a finger down if you have been denied service solely because of the color of your skin.
I mean, I've had younger kids, I've learned more from you than I've learned from my parents. So you're literally contradicting the things that I've been brought up with. And that's what we need to do. That's the key. We have to reprogram the way we have been brought up, the way we have been raised. Sometimes you got to just open a book, Google anything, go online, have your own experiences, go out there and meet people, socialize and stuff like that. And you'll start to learn something different. Take the privilege that you have and uplift your neighbor. We just need to get back to having some level of empathy and compassion for people and get out of our bubbles.
Any fingers left? That's privilege.
Well, good evening, all our middle school students. We would like to welcome each of you to the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum's webinar for our Race Ed and Conscious Conversation project, especially for middle school students. My name is Heather Williams, and I am the Program Director at SACAM. During this webinar, we ask that you please type any questions you may have about the discussion in the Q&A area of the Zoom call, and they will be presented to the panelists as soon as we can get to them. We realize this may be a sensitive subject to some, so if something we discuss makes you feel bad and you would like for us to follow up with you to discuss the topic a little further, please type the letter B in the Q&A area, and we will get back to you after tonight's webinar. To give you a little bit of history about why we are here tonight, the Race Ed Conscious Conversation webinar is the brainchild of two students who currently attend Johnson High School right here in San Antonio, Texas. These two bright students saw a need to educate kids of all grade levels to assist them in coping with the social impacts of what they saw happening around them because of racism and because of prejudices. So they reached out to us at the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum for guidance and for support. We were thrilled to help them in their endeavor. After careful thought, consideration, some research, and a little community feedback, the project began to take shape and the Race Ed Conscious Conversations was born, brought to you by SACAM and Google Fiber. We are very happy that you chose to join us for this month's topic. It's about white privilege. So, without further ado, I am proud to present to you our Race Ed host, Abived Pulapaka. We welcome you, Abived. Now, won't you please introduce our distinguished panelists?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Uh, Today, we have Dr. Catherine Walters with us. Catherine Keeler Walters is an assistant editor at the Handbook of Texas. She received her PhD in history from Texas A&M University in 2018. She researches race and gender history between the 1880s and 1930s and specializes in the history of the civil rights activism movements along with voting rights, the Ku Klux Klan, and structural racism in Texas and the New South. She has taught history courses at various Texas universities and provided research to several publications, including co-authoring a piece with Kyle G. Wilkeson in Impeached: The Removal of Texas Governor James E. Ferguson, a Centennial Examination. In 2017, she was especially honored to present her research on African American civil rights activist and attorney Richard D. Evans, the first president of the Texas State Conference of Branches of the NAACP, at the organization's 80th annual meeting. During COVID, she has had the pleasure of volunteering for SACAM and hopes to continue in the future. Thank you, Dr. Walters, for being here. Additionally, today we have Dr. Lulu with us. Dr. Lulu, also known as the Momatrician, is a board-certified pediatrician and mom of 3 sons. She's proudly Nigerian-born and an LGBTQ plus and youth suicide prevention activist. She is a CEO of TinaLive.com and Dr. Lulu's Youth Health Center, both dedicated to youth suicide prevention. She is a TEDx, United Nations, and Global Pan-African speaker, a 3-time best-selling author, and a freelance writer. She has been featured on local affiliates of ABC, CBS, and NBC, and her articles have been published in blackpast.org, Parents Magazine, The Washington Post, and other syndicated media outlets. She has testified at the Texas House of Representatives and has been recognized by the Nigerians in the Diaspora Commission. She lives in San Antonio, Texas. Thank you for being here, Dr. Lulu. And as always, we have Dr. Sunita Punjabi with us. She is the founder of the Brain Science Symposium for the city of San Antonio. Dr. Sunita Punjabi is known as the Brain Coach, currently practicing in the medical center where she is doing research and is assisting people to create a cause-driven life. Dr. Sunita uses neurointegration technology and psychology to help individuals experience mental transformation that can be maneuvered at the neurological level. Thank you for being here, Dr. Punjabi. And without further ado, if I can invite Dr. Lulu for a topic introduction or thoughts on the topic.
Thank you so much for having me here. Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Lulu. I'm a board certified pediatrician and I'm a mom of 3 sons, just like you said. And so these are mis tres hijos. And so earlier this past summer, like everybody knew, we had the murder of George Floyd, a Black man in America. I, like most people, had my kids home for the holidays because, there was no school. And 2 of my 3 sons went to exercise in the neighborhood. And while they were running in the neighborhood, they were dressed in exercise clothes. They had their earphones on. Both boys went to elementary school, middle school, and high school here in this neighborhood. Someone in the neighborhood called the police on the 2 boys running in the neighborhood. It probably helps to know that my neighborhood has 4 African American and 4 Black people living in it. But regardless, these boys went to school. They stood at the school bus with their other friends in this neighborhood for the last 12 years. And the marked police car essentially escorted them home to my house that night. So as a parent, and not even as a parent, just anybody who hears that kind of story and just knows that about this time, about dusk, about 6 o'clock actually, the the marked police car escorted them home. I know you can imagine how I felt and how afraid the boys were. My eldest son actually, at one interview that they were in, said that all they were going to do was just try to protect their brother because that's all they could think of, like to just get the brother home safe. It wasn't about them. And so I think that's maybe the premise. Not that I'm alone in that experience, mine is mine. So thank you so much for having me here, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Lulu. And to begin with our questions, something that happened a couple of weeks ago is something that's been on a lot of our minds recently, and that was the insurgents at the Capitol. It was terrifying for all ages, all groups, and it was widely seen on all forms of media. So, to preface this question, with the recent events at the Capitol, many people thought that if the protesters had been mostly Black or other people of color, that there would have been a different outcome, that the situation would have been dealt with differently. How is this an example of white privilege? And how might this difference be explained by police or policing? And if Dr. Punjabi, you want to begin with that question, and then we can move on to the rest of the panelists.
So I've done actually a lot of soul searching and speaking with um, my friends that are of different color than I am. I am brown, as most Indians, I guess we look. Um, but what happened at the Capitol? So white privilege is something that is not necessarily any one person's fault, but it does subconsciously affect how we respond to people. So it's not even, I want to take it off of any one person, but even as an Indian person, it's in our culture to think that flowing straight blonde hair is better than curly ethnic looking hair. I spend money because my curly hair is considered unprofessional. What happened at the Capitol, at our nation's capital, was people assuming about putting people into a box and assuming the motivation was different from the motivation of other people, assuming that there wasn't a threat when there really was. So what happened at our nation's capital was people just jumping, and it's like a fish in water. We don't even realize what water is until we're taken out of it. And then we're sort of flailing around. But what happened at our nation's capital was assumptions. We were putting people and assuming that there wasn't a threat, that this was going to be some small event, and it wasn't. It destroyed us to the core. It affected us as a nation. The rates of confusion and depression that I've seen since that event, and just general sense of disappointment in our leadership, it rocked our nation. And I don't think any of us thought that would happen because of the color of the people and the appearance of the people that showed up that day.
Thank you, Dr. Punjabi. And as you were just talking about, you premised this off of a question of assumption. So if Dr. Lulu, you can discuss how the police or these types of policing systems have facilitated these forms of assumptions or have demonstrated this form of privilege, please.
I think what I'll begin by saying, the police is made up of regular people. When I joined the Air Force several years ago, one of the questions I asked my recruiter was like, okay, so what kind of people are in the Air Force? And I remember he said, just the Air Force is a sample of the population of the regular people. So the police are not some special humans, if that makes any sense. They are our brothers and our sisters and our cousins and our nephews and our fathers and our sisters. I mean, they are part of the community. So it's not just one way of, I mean, yeah, you could say it's one way of thinking of the police, but it's also the general populace. We all think that way. I mean, why anyone will will assume that tens of thousands of armed white militia, then tens of thousands of them with arms, pipe bombs, and hangman's nooses, and all kinds of things, are innocent and somehow are not going to cause any trouble when they had just been instructed by their leader to march down and fight. I mean, it just makes no sense. And in sharp contrast to, over the summer, we had young, innocent people, unarmed, this just happened to be Black, and we had the whole National Guard called. So I don't even know how to explain the mental state that it takes to look at those two things. And it doesn't end at the policing. It doesn't end at the insurrection. It's every single day. You know, when a Black man is arrested, he's presumed guilty, regardless of who he is and who he was. It doesn't make any sense. There's a deep-seated decay in the community that obviously is made up of normal human beings who have homes with brothers and sisters and children. And so starting young is the key, telling everybody when they are young that we are equal and we have to remain equal. And then there are other things, obviously, but I'm just going to stop there. So I don't even know if I answered the question, but that's kind of what I was thinking about.
Absolutely. And Dr. Walters, if you can give maybe a historical perspective as well as your analysis of what happened and how it relates to white privilege.
Yes. Well, I think the clearest example is comparing it to the Black Lives Matter movements over this summer and the previous years, as well as looking at the violence at Charlottesville, where the treatment of one group over the other group was quite clear, both by law enforcement as well as government officials, including the president at the time. I think one clear example of white privilege in this situation, especially when it comes to policing as well as the judicial system, is that these individuals weren't arrested as they left the building. In any other situation, they would have been, had they been Black or Indigenous or anyone of color. If you look at the protests over the Keystone Pipeline a few years ago, those protesters were violently arrested, as well as they had water sprayed at them at really high rates, which is incredibly painful, and it was very cold at the time as well, without any regard to their safety or health. And I think the situation is pretty clear that they were just allowed to walk out of the building. And in other situations, they would have been arrested, maybe even arrested and beaten, like many protesters at the Black Lives Matter movement. And possibly even killed, like some of the protesters at Black Lives Matter protests. And then those who have been arrested, they were allowed low bail for that. It was $10,000 for one individual. And you compare that to other crimes that were less consequential, and it's pretty obvious that there is a privilege. And like the other two ladies have said, part of it is that it's just in the culture. It's just kind of all around, and people don't even think about it. And I think the key element is to understand that there's a history in the United States of white supremacy. There's a history in the United States where this was all at one time normal, and it wasn't combated in the same ways, and most white people felt this way. And during that time, it just kind of seeped into the American culture. It seeped into the language. It seeped into the structure elements, the political structures, the government structures, the banking structure, economic structures, and it kind of seeped into the culture. And as every generation in the United States kind of moves through our lives, we've kind of absorbed all that, and we don't even realize it until we actively start to pull it apart and look at ourselves and look at society and realize where this has come from, where it has fallen from. And policing in African American history has traditionally been in place where it was abusive during slavery, but it was going after those people who were enslaved and who had, tried to free themselves. Once slavery ended, the policing system took over. And in that situation, law enforcement officers had pretty much carte blanche to arrest and charge with a crime. It could be anything from vagrancy or loitering. And then those individuals would serve time, and it would be a long time to pay off fines that really shouldn't even have been charged in the first place. And so what ends up happening is that those individuals would be leased out to work on the farms that their fathers or their brothers or their uncles had been enslaved upon. And so it's one system that replaced another system, and the stereotypes that came out of that as well, with this idea of criminality being as some sort of inherent trait to a particular race, or the reverse of that, morality being an inherent trait of a particular race. These things just kind of seeped in, and the implicit bias that people talk about quite a bit, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about this idea that a bunch of white people getting together, they're not going to do anywhere near as much harm as this idea of Black Lives Matter protesters, which of course is not true. And this is why the Capitol Police likely were completely unprepared. That, or that they agreed with at least some of them agreed with what the protesters were doing. So.
Thank you, Dr. Walters. And you touched upon something that I find really interesting. It's this concept that what we saw a couple weeks ago was something that's obvious. You can compare it. And you also talked about how this form of privilege seeps into something that's systemic, something like our culture, our discourse, representations throughout all forms of media. So could you explain how white privilege kind of shows itself through our culture, through common everyday occurrences, some stuff that's less obvious than what we saw a couple of weeks ago?
Sure. I think a big part of it that we don't even realize that we see are the concept of light and dark being related to good and bad. It is a old cultural visual symbol of good and bad. And it comes from this time period in history that I was talking about, this period of white supremacy and racism when it was just commonplace. And we don't even realize we're seeing it. I'm a mother of 3 as well. And, I never had to worry about my kids running down the street and being followed by a police officer. I've never been followed walking through a store of any kind. So in those instances, these things are very clear to me. But as I was raising my kids and having taken some classes on this, it became quite clear that these messages of light and dark, good and bad, which are not equated. That's a cultural equation that they were pulled together. We see it in Disney movies. We see it in children's books. And I offer an example often of The Lion King, which a lot of people have seen, because The Lion King is not about human beings, but even from those 2 lions, Simba's father and Simba's uncle, you can tell which one Disney, the artist, wanted to show was the good guy and the bad guy. The father's mane is a light brown, and the evil uncle has a dark mane, black mane with a big scar on his face. And the hyenas are dark, and they're, working together. And it is just this, if you look at children's books, if you look at movies, even Star Wars, there's a light and a dark. In the first one, at least, or Star Wars 4, I should say, with Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. I mean, these symbols, visual images, are quite clear to people. And until we start to pull that apart, do we really kind of see it? It's much clearer in the older movies. They are working at it. Pixar, I hear, is working on it. So.
Can I add something to that? Well, it's easy for us to pick on Pixar and pick on, the movies. It's because it's in our faces. I want to echo what Dr. Punjabi said. I'm Nigerian. I'm literally from the motherland. Now, my son's father is what we call a high yellow. He's extremely light-skinned. And light-skinned women in Nigeria, and even if they're not light-skinned, they bleach their skin. We get perms to straighten our hair. When I joined the Air Force, before I joined the Air Force, I had dreadlocks down to my shoulders. And it was like, well, you can't have dreadlocks in the military. Just little things like that, so subtle. Angel's food cake is vanilla flavor. The devil's food cake is chocolate flavor. Well, in Nigeria, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And I think even I want you to notice the ethnic gap. I was told I need to take out, which I share with my sister, Dr. Lulu, this is an ethnic gap. And I was told when I was doing my internship as a resident to get my doctorate, these earrings, by the way, were too ethnic to be professional. So
and I've been told too that my dreadlocks are not professional because they're locks. And so I literally, because I was a lieutenant colonel and a commander in the Air Force, I chose to have locks in the Air Force. And it didn't go unnoticed. Oh my God, what kind of example is this? I said, what kind of example is it? It's my natural hair. What example are you talking about? And today I'm proud to say that the military is changing. Now they allow locks, but some of us had to defy it. It's like, wait, this is my hair. I want to have locks because I can. And so I don't know if this helps, but if you believe in something, if you know in your hearts that that thing is right, I dare to ask you to do it. Nobody else before me dared to do that. But I'm Nigerian. I'm a for different conviction. So coming here is like, oh, you don't let people do that? Okay, I'm gonna do it because I'm not doing anything wrong. Not asking everyone to become rebels because some of us are activists because we just can't help it. But that's how change is born, defying and questioning the norm and the narrative. And so for the kids who are watching, that's the whole essence of this talk, to step out in your purpose and your passion and your knowledge, knowing that it's right. I was not going to apologize for having dreadlocks because I'm not going to ask the next person to apologize for her blonde hair or, whatever, So thank you for talking about that.
Let me add one thing though, to piggyback on what Dr. Lulu said. She said, if something feels right, but someone says it's not the norm, I think that's a key phrase that we need to look at, because I just talked about light and dark, good and bad. There's also this element of what some people call normative whiteness, which means whiteness has over time in American culture become, quote unquote, the norm. And what that means is that label doesn't even get added to something like, for example, an American identity. Who's American? And for some people, when they talk about Americans, or they talk about certain Americans, what they really meant is white Americans. For example, and this was a recent example, there's someone tweeted that, Confederate statues probably are disliked by people who probably didn't have family who lived in the South before 1860. And my response to that is there were plenty of Southerners who had family that lived in the South in the 1860s who disliked the Confederate statues. And a lot of them are African American, because African Americans who come from the South or whose family came from the South, they're Southern too. But the person who tweeted it wasn't thinking of that. They were thinking of white Southerners. And that tends to be what often has to be decoded in our language, is to see where whoever is speaking really meant white Americans or white protesters. They'll say protesters and they'll say black protesters, as if, one is the normal, one is the standard, and then there is an other. I see it quite a bit also, like I'm from New Braunfels. New Braunfels has a New Braunfels Chamber of Commerce, but then they have a New Braunfels Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, as if that is an auxiliary or not as good as or not the standard, and the other one is, when actually they just formed a different one because they were not allowed to join the first one initially. So that element, that normative whiteness that doesn't even get included, is something we also have to look for in our own language.
But Dr. Walters, even if you extend that to who is black, I like the question, who is white, but who is black? It's almost like, well, you're not white enough because you've got 0.0001. Who's checking the percentage of blackness? Why do you feel a need to check how and why? And when they say, well, if you have one drop of blood, you're black, that is diminutive. The mindset behind that is a negative connotation. So if you have 99.99% white, you're black, because they're trying to put something negative to it when it shouldn't be so. And so my middle son is dark chocolate. And people used to ask me when I had his brother, whose child is that? I had the baby on the breast, and I don't know if I can say that to middle schoolers or not, breastfeeding him. And they asked me, whose child is that? Because, well, I don't know. I mean, just come out and say it. He's light skinned, so he can't be my child. You know what I mean? So those are subtle ways of dropping little droplets. And they're like, you're right when they say the intruders versus the black man that broke in.
I think, especially in middle school, there's such a desire. It's so normal to want to fit in. And there's like, it's almost life or death possibly right now, especially if you're in middle school. It's very normal part of your development to want to be part of what everyone else is doing. So normal. But if you're feeling an inclination of uncomfortableness, if you're being asked to change, I didn't even really think about it. I was so, it's a silly example, but my hair, if I kept being told that if I wore my hair ethnic and I wore it out, like my hair is actually very curly, that I didn't look professional. And this was from my friends of color and, my Caucasian friends. And I was just told I didn't look professional. And it really, I mean, that means I have to get out of my schedule and go get my hair fixed every week. It's simple stuff like that. When you're asked to do something that is uncomfortable, that's a detector for you that you're being asked to compromise and to change, and it may not be for your benefit. That's the kind of stuff you want to talk about. Talk with your counselor, talk with your parents, talk with, we've been talking about your tribe. Find people that are also asking questions, but when you're being asked and it's uncomfortable, that's the time. Don't try and fit into the normal, although that's where your heart may be right now.
But also, since we're talking to middle schoolers, I want you to be the one who talks to the one kid that no one is talking to. I challenge you to be the one to ask, well, why not? Versus why? Why not? Well, why should we let them? Because they're new, because they're African, because they're black, because they have an accent. People listen to me and like, I know what they want to say, but they say, I like your accent. Really, what they're saying is, your accent is different, and not in a positive way. Until I say, well, you know what? I speak 8 languages. And then they're like, what? Yes, I'm a polyglot. How many you speak? One, really? And then, so that you come in and you're black with a dreadlocks or whatnot, and you're right away sized up as non-entity. And then you open your mouth, oh, wow. Oh, you mean you have, oh, you mean, so I'm challenging you to take people at face value, because you never know who the person is that's walking into your space and what they're going to do for you or to you down the line 5, 10 years from now. And so taking people as they are, there's a lot to be said about that, especially since you're making your friends now and collecting your tribesmen right now. It is time for you to step out and be the one for that person who is not treated right.
And I would like to add that norm, this idea of wanting to be like everyone else and wanting to be normal, there is no such thing as a norm. That's an illusion. And it's created by American culture and all cultures to have this sense of what is beautiful and what is better and what is professional. These standards. And there really isn't such a thing as a norm. It really doesn't exist. I used to tell my child that if anybody ever called them weird, that they should say thank you, because that was a compliment. Because weird meant that you were unique, and it's better to be unique and to be your own person. But everybody trying to conform to being something else, those norms, those ideas of beauty and professionalism, those were created a long time ago to sell things and to promote certain ideas of health and beauty, and they really were coming out of a racist society where the norm or the beauty was defined by a certain look. And no matter how much we try, how much people have been trying for a long time, at least since the 1960s, to get rid of some of these ideas, they still hang on. And so challenge that idea of even there being a norm.
And to add to that, talking about beauty, I'm so glad we went there. The current reigning Miss Universe, who's from South Africa, she has short hair. She was told, you cannot wear your hair like that. What do you mean? What do you mean you're going for Miss Universe with short hair? She has a cropped cut. Because for once, we don't have a Miss Anything wearing flowing Brazilian fake hair. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but then there was something wrong with her, because in their eyes, she didn't have the hair at the weave and, but she said, no, I want to have my hair natural. For the first time ever in the history of beauty queens, she was like, I'm going to have my short haircut, and that's it. And then when she opened her mouth, she blew them away with intelligence and smartness and her vocabulary. And then if you Google right now, beautiful women, the first 6 pages of Google do not have one black woman. Like literally, I kid you not, or a person of color. Beautiful women. Something as simple as that in 2021. So, what is beauty?
Thank you, Dr. Lulu. And if Dr. Punjabi, you could close this conversation off with a topic closure.
I think that we all need to really understand the impact of what is white privilege. And I'm asking that if you are not a person of color, if you're not brown, like I am, if you are Caucasian, like my dear friend, Dr. Catherine, consider unpacking your privilege. And I actually, just a few minutes ago, I was asking Catherine, how do you feel if I say that? Are you okay with that? And you can have that conversation with people that don't look like you. How do you feel if I say this? And have those conversations. I really want to end. Martin Luther King said that until you are all that you can be, I will never be all that I can be. And just educate yourself about what it is to live like someone that doesn't look like you. Um, my sister-in-law actually is a beautiful blonde Californian, looks a lot like Catherine. And I sat with her and I asked her, how do you feel about the events that happened September 6th? And we had a real conversation. And I was humbled and joyed that she was actually very upset by what she saw. And she was very disappointed. Um, so have those conversations and just remember, um, if you are offended by the conversation of white privilege, be willing to listen, be willing to take some action and hear the stories. And that's real education. And that's how I think we can change this.
So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the wind-swept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
Thank you for joining this month's Conscious Conversations as we discussed white privilege. I would like to thank the SACAM board, staff, and volunteers who work tirelessly on behalf of SACAM. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, Google Fiber, for making Race Ed possible. We extend a heartfelt thank you to our panelists this evening, Dr. Catherine Keeler-Walters, Dr. Lulu, and Dr. Sunita Punjabi. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting for making this conversation possible. Mark your calendars to join us next month, Monday, February 22nd, as we have another Conscious Conversation virtual discussion on facing systemic racism. For more information about SACAM and the programs we offer, follow us on social media and check out our website, sacam.org. Thank you again and have a good night.